May 13th, 1862, 3 a.m. Charleston Harbor is silent except for the lap of water against wooden hulls and the distant call of sentries on Fort Sumter. The USS Planter, a Confederate armed transport steamer, sits moored at Southern Wharf. On board, a 23-year-old enslaved man named Robert Smalls is watching the clock. He's been watching it all night, waiting for the white officers to leave for the evening like they always do. They trust him. Why wouldn't they? He's just the wheelman, the enslaved pilot who's been navigating Charleston's treacherous harbor for years. He knows every sandbar, every channel, every current. He's valuable property, loyal, obedient. They have no idea he's about to steal their warship. Robert Smalls wasn't supposed to be a revolutionary. He was born enslaved in 1839 in Beaufort, South Carolina, the property of Henry McKee. His mother, Lydia, worked as a house servant, and she made sure young Robert saw everything. When he was 12, she did something unthinkable. She deliberately had him witness slave auctions. She walked him past the whipping posts. She made him watch families torn apart on the auction block. Why? Because she wanted him to understand the system. She wanted him angry. And it worked. By the time Robert was a teenager, he'd been hired out to work in Charleston. His owner rented his labor to various businesses and pocketed the wages. Robert worked the docks, worked on ships, learned navigation, learned how the harbor worked, and most importantly, he learned how the Confederate Navy worked. By 1861, he was the wheelman aboard the Planter, a 150-foot sidewheel steamer that the Confederates had converted into an armed transport. It carried troops, supplies, and artillery to the forts defending Charleston. It was also armed with 4 cannons and carried the Confederate flag. Robert piloted that ship every single day. He knew its engine quirks, its draft, its turning radius. He knew which channels were mined and which were clear. He knew the signal codes for passing Fort Sumter, Fort Moultrie, and Fort Johnson. He knew everything. And the Confederate officers treated him like furniture. They discussed military plans right in front of him. They left maps out. They never imagined that an enslaved man was memorizing every detail, waiting for the perfect moment to use it. That moment came in May 1862. The white officers had gotten into the habit of spending their nights ashore, leaving the enslaved crew to guard the ship. It was a lazy kind of arrogance, the assumption that enslaved people were too docile, too ignorant, too loyal to do anything dangerous. Robert had been planning this for months. He'd recruited the other enslaved crewmen one by one, speaking in whispers during loading operations, testing their courage, making sure they understood the stakes. If they failed, they'd be hanged, not imprisoned, not beaten, hanged, in public, as a warning to every other enslaved person in the Confederacy. But if they succeeded, they'd be free. On the night of May 12th, the white officers left the ship as usual. Captain Relay and his crew headed into Charleston for the evening, leaving Robert and 7 other enslaved men aboard. Robert waited until he was sure they weren't coming back. Then he gave the signal. The crew fired up the boilers, quietly. No shouting, no commotion, just the low hiss of steam building pressure. At 3:15 a.m., Robert gave the order. Cast off. The Planter's paddle wheels began to turn. The ship eased away from the dock and into the black water of Charleston Harbor. If anyone on shore noticed, they didn't react. A Confederate transport moving at night wasn't unusual, but Robert wasn't heading to a fort or a supply depot. He was heading to a prearranged meeting point where his wife Hannah and their 3 children were waiting, along with the families of the other crewmen. 12 more people, including an infant. They'd been hiding in a safe house, waiting for Robert's signal. The Planter pulled up to the rendezvous point. The families scrambled on board in the darkness, kissing their children and whispering prayers. Robert's wife kissed him once, her hands shaking. She knew exactly what would happen if they were caught. Then Robert turned the ship toward the harbor mouth, toward the open ocean, toward the Union blockade, toward freedom. But first, he had to get past 5 Confederate forts. Fort Johnson, Fort Sumter, Fort Moultrie, Castle Pinckney, Fort Ripley, all armed with artillery, all manned by Confederate soldiers who would open fire on any ship that didn't give the proper signals. And those signals changed regularly. Robert had memorized the current codes, but if the Confederates had changed them in the last 24 hours, he was dead. The first test was Fort Johnson. As the Planter approached, Robert pulled on Captain Relay's straw hat, the one he wore every day. From a distance, in the darkness, Robert looked like the captain. Same build, same hat, same posture at the wheel. He gave the signal. 3 short blasts on the steam whistle, then 2 long ones, the recognition code. His hand was shaking so badly he almost missed the sequence. Silence. Then, from the fort, a lantern waved. Permission to pass. Robert exhaled. 1 down, 4 to go. Fort Sumter was next. This was the big one. The fort where the Civil War had started, now the most heavily armed position in Charleston Harbor. If they were going to get caught, it would be here. Robert slowed the engines, drifting toward the fort at the exact speed and angle that the planter always used. He wore the captain's hat. He stood the way the captain stood. He even mimicked the man's slouch. In the darkness, he looked like just another Confederate officer making a routine run. He gave the signal, the same 3 short blasts, 2 long ones, the recognition code. His hand was shaking so badly he almost missed the sequence. Silence. Then from the fort, a lantern waved. Permission to pass. Robert exhaled a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. His wife was below deck, holding their children, praying in whispers. The other families were huddled together, silent and terrified. They were past Sumter. They were in the outer harbor, but they weren't safe yet, because ahead of them at the mouth of the harbor was Fort Moultrie, and beyond that, the open ocean where the Union Navy was waiting. The Union blockade was a problem, but it was a different kind of problem. The Union ships would see a Confederate steamer flying a Confederate flag and assume it was trying to run the blockade to escape. They'd open fire. Robert had planned for this. As soon as they cleared Fort Moultrie, he ordered the crew to lower the Confederate flag and raise a white bedsheet. It wasn't a proper surrender flag, but it was all they had. The bedsheet flapped in the wind, pale and ghostly in the pre-dawn light. Then Robert pointed the planter directly at the USS Onward, one of the Union blockade ships. He opened the throttle. The planter surged forward, white sheet flying, moving at full speed toward the Federal warship. From the deck of the Onward, this looked insane, a Confederate ship charging them at full speed with what appeared to be a surrender flag. It could be a trick. It could be a suicide attack. It could be a ship loaded with explosives trying to ram them. The Onward's cannons swiveled toward the planter. The gun crews loaded. The order to fire was about to be given. Then, at the last second, the sun crested the horizon, just enough light to see the deck of the planter. And standing on that deck, clearly visible now, were women and children, families, enslaved families, not soldiers. The Union captain held his fire. The planter pulled alongside the Onward, and Robert Smalls stepped out onto the deck. He was still wearing Captain Rayleigh's hat. He looked up at the Union officers and said in perfect English, "Good morning, sir. I've brought you some of the old United States guns, sir." The Union officers stared at him. Then they looked at the ship, the CSS Planter, a fully armed, fully operational Confederate transport steamer with its cannons, its ammunition, its signal codes, and its maps. Robert Smalls hadn't just escaped. He delivered the Confederacy's own warship to the Union Navy, complete with intelligence on the positions, armaments, and weaknesses of every fort in Charleston Harbor. The Union captain didn't know whether to laugh or salute. He did both. Within hours, the Planter was a Union vessel. Within days, Robert Smalls was a celebrity in the North. Newspapers ran his story on the front page. Abolitionists held him up as proof that enslaved people were capable, intelligent, and brave. President Lincoln met with him personally. Congress awarded him and his crew prize money for capturing an enemy vessel. Robert used that money to buy the house where he'd been born into slavery. He bought his old master's house and moved his mother into it. The property of Henry McKee now owned Henry McKee's property. But Robert didn't stop there. He joined the Union Navy as a pilot. He guided Union ships through the same waters he'd used to escape. He piloted the USS Keokuk during the attack on Fort Sumter, taking enemy fire while navigating the exact harbor he'd fled a year earlier. He ended the war as a captain in the Union Navy, the first black captain in U.S. military history. After the war, Robert went into politics. He served 5 terms in the United States House of Representatives, representing South Carolina. He fought for black voting rights, for public education,
for land reform. He was there when the Confederacy tried to rise again during Reconstruction. He watched former slave owners reclaim power through terror and violence, and he never stopped fighting. In 1895, during the South Carolina Constitutional Convention, white Democrats were trying to disenfranchise black voters. Robert Smalls stood up in that convention and spoke for 4 hours. He reminded them that he'd risked his life to steal a Confederate warship, that he'd fought for the Union, that he'd earned his citizenship and his rights. He dared them to look him in the eye and tell him he wasn't fit to vote. They passed the disenfranchisement laws anyway, because the system Robert had fought against his entire life was still alive, still hungry, still grinding people into dust. Robert Smalls died in 1915 at the age of 75. He died in the same house where he'd been born enslaved. He'd lived long enough to see the Confederacy defeated, Reconstruction rise and fall, and Jim Crow take root. He watched the freedoms he fought for get stripped away piece by piece. But he never regretted stealing that ship. He never regretted risking everything for a chance at freedom. Because Robert Smalls understood something that the Confederacy never could. Freedom isn't given, it's taken. And sometimes you have to steal a warship at 3 in the morning, navigate past 5 enemy forts in the dark, and bet your life on a bedsheet flag to get it. The USS Planter served the Union Navy for the rest of the war. After 1865, it was decommissioned and eventually scrapped. But its theft changed the course of the Civil War. The intelligence Robert brought with him helped the Union plan the siege of Charleston. The signal codes he memorized allowed Union ships to move freely through Confederate waters. And his story proved to the world that enslaved people weren't passive victims waiting to be freed. They were fighters, strategists, and warriors who would risk everything for a chance at liberty. Today, there's a statue of Robert Smalls in Beaufort, South Carolina. He's standing tall, looking out toward the water, toward the harbor where he once stole a warship and changed history. The plaque at the base reads, "My race needs no special defense, for the past history of them in this country proves them to be equal of any people anywhere. All they need is an equal chance in the battle of life." He said that in 1895. It's still true. Because history isn't just written by the people who win battles. It's written by the people who refuse to stay enslaved. It's written by the man who steals a warship at 3 a.m. and sails it straight into enemy cannons with nothing but a bedsheet for a flag. It's written by the people who look at an impossible situation and say, "Watch me." Robert Smalls proved that you don't need an army to change the world. You just need courage, a plan, and the willingness to risk everything when the moment comes. Because freedom isn't free. It never has been. And sometimes you have to steal it.